What's up guys, my name is Ace, and I finally had some time to go through all of the community skill data that was submitted to me. And just a quick recap, if you guys aren't familiar with the situation, a little while back one of my viewers discovered that you could find your hidden skill rating in Call of Duty by submitting a personal data request through Activision. And this is something they legally have to provide you, depending on your region of course. But when they provide that file, it includes a ton of data, including data on literally every single match you've played since at least Call of Duty Vanguard. I've seen it go back to Modern Warfare 2019 for some people. And as part of that data, you see your skill rating. And this is your hidden skill rating that you don't get to see in game, and yet it's used in the matchmaking to determine what kind of matches you end up getting. Now, it took a little time after the first video, but tons of people started getting their data after a couple weeks of requesting it. And I asked you guys to share that data with me if you wanted to, of course, with personal information removed. And I was very surprised to see over 500 submissions. So thank you guys so much. That blew me away, the amount of submissions I got here with data. Unfortunately, 500 is way too many for me to handle. So I ended up taking a random sample of 50 of these data points, and I wanted to analyze those today and share some of the findings with you guys. In addition to this, I'm going to be sharing all of the data for these 50 samples. I can't share all 500, unfortunately, because I can't ensure that everybody removed personal information. But for these 50, I was going through them quite extensively, so I know that they're clean. And I'm going to be sharing this spreadsheet with you guys, so some of you guys can do your own data analysis. I know there's many in the community that are far better at this than I am. And also, you just might be curious about certain stats that I don't cover in today's video, because I am going to keep things quite focused here. Just a quick note, if you decide to do some data analysis with this, make sure you do isolate out the private matches, which I have done with my data. And the way to find if it's a private match for sure is in the XP at end column. That will be 0 for all private matches. So if you just eliminate all of those from the equation, then you'll get your accurate data for public matches. And without further ado, let's dive into what I wanted to look at in today's video specifically. One thing I noticed a lot of people doing with their data in the community is just looking at any of the stats that correlated with the skill value. So everything from damage dealt to damage received to the number of shots that you fired in a match, for instance. And unfortunately, those types of correlations won't really mean anything because almost all of those data points lack context. Namely, they're not accounting for the amount of time that you're in each one of those matches, or which game modes you're playing, for instance. So I wanted to dive a bit deeper than those, and focus on a key set of stats that I feel are actually representative of somebody's performance. So these stats we're going to look at are kill-death ratio, actual kill-death ratio, not elimination death ratio. Your average kill-death spread, so the average difference between the number of kills you got in a match versus deaths you got in a match. And that is a very important stat, and I'll explain why later. I also wanted to look at score per minute, but the problem with score per minute values is if you're looking at an overall score per minute value, it doesn't really mean anything if you don't have the context of game modes attached to that, because the best player in the world playing Search and Destroy is going to have a way lower score per minute than an average domination player, for instance, because the score per minute values are just so different. So I was actually able to isolate some game mode specific score per minute values, and I was quite excited to take a look at those. And then finally, I wanted to take a look at win-loss ratio, since I have a lot of people that ask about that all the time. And let's go over my findings, starting it off with career kill-death ratio versus skill. And here are the 50 data points, or actually 52 data points. There's a couple I wanted to point out here. There's two clear outliers here. And the first one with the really high kill-death ratio, but not even really amazing skill average. This is somebody that in their email when they submitted the data, they mentioned that they 2-box, which means they cheese themselves into extremely easy lobbies, like the lowest of low skill lobbies by joining on a reverse boosted account. So they're not actually participating in the matchmaking system like everybody else is. And as we've already discovered before, if you are doing this and playing against nothing but really low skill players all the time, even if your performance is incredible, your skill value won't be super high because it does depend on the skill level of the players that you're playing against as well. If you're playing against the worst players in the world every game, no matter how good you do, you're not going to get a great skill rating. And that's where the other suspicious outlier comes in. Now, this one didn't have any context attached to it, but after looking at all of the stats, not just kill-death ratio, but several other stats as well, and combining that with where their skill rating was sitting, it seemed pretty obvious that they're doing something with the matchmaking as well. And as a result, I decided to remove both of these outliers from the equation, simply because they're skewing the data in a way that isn't representative of what most players experience, which is actual matchmaking. But with those outliers removed, this is our career kill-death ratio versus skill average trend. And as you can see, there's definitely a correlation here. Now, if we look at our correlation coefficient here, it's 0.79, which is actually quite solid. So that's a reasonably strong correlation between your kill-death ratio average and your skill average. Also, this is where I want to point out, my initial guess when I first started seeing some data was that a skill rating of 0 was actually average, and you can get into the negatives. And based on what we're seeing here, that seems to line up. If you have right around a 1 kill-death ratio, it's likely you're going to be fairly close to 0 with that skill average, whether you're a little bit below 0 or a little little bit above. So kill death ratio is actually a somewhat good predictor of what your skill average is. But obviously it's not perfect, and as your skill rating increases, you start to see it deviate more from the trend line there. So it's absolutely not everything, but it is actually quite a good indicator of skill, despite what many people say. And the reason many people say this is you can kind of cheese a higher kill death ratio to a degree. A not so great player could just like camp in a corner, play objective game modes, but never touch the objective, and sort of pad their kill death ratio stats. So this is why I wanted to look at your average kill spread, or the average difference between the amount of kills you got in a match versus the amount of deaths that you got in a match. So just as an example here, if I get 15 kills and 10 deaths, that means in that match, I got a kill spread of 5. Whereas if it were the opposite and I got 10 kills and 15 deaths, now my kill spread for that match is -5. This is a much harder stat to artificially skew, at least in the positive direction, because no matter how hard you try to cheese it, a bad player is very unlikely to get a large average kill spread, because camping for 6 kills and 2 deaths throughout an entire game of domination, while that's a 3 kill death ratio, which is really impressive, that only gives you a kill spread of 4, which is not that great for what you would typically expect out of a 3 kill death ratio player. So I calculated the kill spread for every single match every one of these players played, and then I took their average and compared it to their skill rating, and this is what we ended up with. It turns out this is actually the strongest correlation I found to your skill rating. The correlation coefficient on this was 0.83, so quite a strong correlation here. And again, not surprisingly, when you have a skill average of 0, you're likely to have an average kill spread right around 0 as well. So this just reinforces the fact that a 0 skill rating appears to be the average. And I guess I should also mention, out of these 50 samples, the highest average skill rating that a player got was 548, and the lowest was -237. That's just out of this sample. I'm sure the data that was submitted to me skews a little bit more toward the higher skill side, and that's why we're seeing mostly things to the right of 0 rather than the left of 0. And that's most likely just due to the fact that like the really, really low skilled players that aren't really all that invested in the game at all, they're not watching YouTube videos about the game, they're not submitting personal data requests to find out what their skill rating is, and therefore, of course, you're not likely to see their data represented here, but I would assume there's probably just as many people on the really low end as well, we just don't get to see that data. In either case, like I said, the average kill spread was the strongest correlation I found to your skill rating. Next, let's get into our score per minute values. And again, keep in mind, I isolated for game mode here as well, because that's just absolutely necessary if you're looking at score per minute for it to actually mean anything. And the first game mode I isolated for was Team Deathmatch. And I was quite surprised to find here, there isn't a super strong correlation between your Team Deathmatch score per minute average and your skill rating. There's a bit of a trend, there's some correlation there, but it's not a very strong correlation. The coefficient I found on this was 0.66, and it was a very similar story when I looked at domination score per minute averages versus skill rating. We got a correlation coefficient here of 0.61, which again shows there is a bit of a correlation, it's just not a really strong correlation by any means. And I was honestly very surprised to see these results. Before going into this, I actually thought that game mode specific score per minute was likely going to be the strongest correlation that we would find to skill, because generally speaking, if you're getting a lot of score in a short period of time relative to others, you're probably having a really big impact on the match, and you're likely going to be quite a skilled player if you're able to do that consistently. So I was actually quite surprised to find in domination, for instance, you could have a domination score per minute average of 400 and be a really highly skilled player with an average skill rating above 400 as well, or you could have a negative skill rating and still have a domination score per minute average around 400. So score per minute, even when isolated for game mode, doesn't appear to be a very strong indicator of skill. And that was not a result I expected to see. Back in the day when we had access to lobby leaderboards and could see score per minute values before getting into a match, that was almost always a very good predictor of how that match was going to go. And you could also very reliably see who was going to be at the top of the scoreboard at the end of the game, based on their game mode specific score per minute. But surprisingly, it doesn't appear to be a very strong indicator of your skill rating in this game, at least not as strong as your kill death ratio or your kill death spread. But finally, the last stat I wanted to take a look at here is win-loss ratio versus skill average. Because I have had a lot of people suggest that win-loss ratio would be a heavy correlation, I didn't believe that would be the case, and it turns out I was right. There is a very weak correlation here. It's the weakest out of all of these ones that I looked at today by far, with a correlation coefficient of just 0.38. And this means being a higher skilled player isn't really going to yield a higher win-loss ratio on average, at least not to a large degree. You might get slightly more wins on average, but I would say more than anything, win-loss ratio is just an indicator of whether or not you play in a party. And the reason behind that, and the reason I'm not surprised at all to see this, is first up, they have a very strong team balancing algorithm in this game, meaning that in every game, it appears they're trying to balance out the average skill rating of both teams even if that means screwing over a highly skilled solo player by giving them all of the worst players on their team in order to get an overall balance, but then that puts the entire weight of the match on their shoulders. And if they don't match the performances expected out of them based on their skill rating, then they're almost definitely going to lose the game. That's the first part of it, and the reason I'm not surprised at all. If you play solo and you have good stats, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to that. So it really seems like they're trying to aim for 50-50 there. But then there's the other part of this, which I am going to call a theory at this point. This is the engagement optimized matchmaking system. I do feel this is present. I do think this is there, but I can't confirm with absolute certainty that it is implemented into the game. But I believe there is a system in place where if you are getting too many losses in a row, the algorithm doesn't want you to leave the game and quit and then potentially never return. It wants to keep you hooked and playing the game, and therefore it's going to try really hard to matchmake you in the next match and ensure that you're on the winning team, regardless of what your skill level is. You could be a very low skill player that's a huge anchor to your team, but the system's going to try real hard to make sure that you end up on the winning team, and it will stack you with good teammates to ensure that you do get the win, or at least massively increase the odds that you're going to be winning that next match, and therefore trying to keep your win-loss ratio at least roughly around 1. Now again, I'm not 100% sure that that's in place, but it does feel like there's a system like that that's guiding things in that direction. In either case, as we're seeing from the data, your win-loss ratio isn't heavily correlated to skill, so getting much better at the game doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be winning much more often. Maybe a little bit more often, but not much more often. And there we go. That's going to wrap it up for all of the data I wanted to share with you guys today. Some of the correlations I was looking at, like I said, your kill-death spread is the strongest correlation I was able to find, and it is a fairly strong correlation, but unfortunately, we can't see that in the game anywhere. It's not stated in your combat record. And therefore, unfortunately, I think the best indicator we've currently got that you can actually see looking at the in-game stats is going to be your elimination death ratio. Now, I know my correlation was looking at kill death ratio, not elimination death ratio, but since you can't see that, the next best thing is your elimination death ratio. And I know many in the community won't be happy to see that. I know there's people with very strong opinions that elimination death ratio or kill death ratio doesn't mean anything in Call of Duty. It's not an indicator of skill, but the stats tend to disagree with that, and I believe that is the best single indicator we've got. Although I do want to reiterate, it's not a perfect indicator by any means, especially if you're manipulating matchmaking in any way. At that point, your skill rating just gets thrown out the window anyway. And with that, I've just got some final thoughts on this that I wanted to share. One big comment that came up a lot the last time I talked about this skill data, and I was asking for you guys to submit it. One really common type of comment was, why do you care? Why are you bothering with this? What is this going to change? And my answer is quite simply, I'm curious. I want to understand the system better. I want to know why the matchmaking experience can vary so drastically between two different players with different skill ratings, and why people are essentially playing different versions of the same game without having anything to show for it. I'm curious to know how they're calculating the skill rating, and whether or not there's any way that we can sort of at least somewhat track that with our stats in the game itself. And I would say at least one of my end goals with this is I would like to perhaps start a community push to have them display our skill rating in-game. If our in-game experience is going to be heavily determined based on what our skill rating is, we should be able to at least see our skill rating, see where we stand, track our improvement over time, because these are key components to any sort of competitive experience, whether that's a sport or a video game, whatever it is. If you're going to be competing based on what your skill level is, it's very important to see where you stand when it comes to that and track your improvement over time if you are improving. I know not everybody cares about that, and that's totally fine. You don't need to look at that value. I think that value should be displayed, though, in our combat record, just like XDefiant did. I love that they had that skill rating. It gave you something to strive for. You could actually work on improving, and I think it would be a lot less frustrating to be matched based on skill if you could at least see what that skill rating is. And I know that's what ranked play should be for, and public matches should be much more casual, but at the end of the day, that's not the case, and it doesn't look like their matchmaking system is going anywhere anytime soon. So if it's going to be there, and our experience is going to be determined very heavily based on what our skill rating is, then we should at least be able to see what our skill rating is in the game. Now, of course, those are just my opinions, and I'm really curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How did you feel about the results that I shared today? And if you decided to take a deeper look, please share some of the results that you found as well with this sample that I shared in the description down below. Or maybe even if you notice some trends with your own data, please share that as well. If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.